Hello everybody, my name is Walter and this is episode 4 of the Redstone Tips and Tricks Series. Today I would like to answer a question that has been asked a couple times in the comments in the past, and that is how you can connect, for example, multiple levers to a single door. I will do this in 3 steps. First, I'll very briefly cover the common inputs for doors and similar contraptions. Then I will talk about connecting multiple levers and buttons. And then finally I will get to the subject of spam proofing, so making sure even if someone continuously presses a button, the door will not break. And with that, let's get started with the common ways to control doors. Now, when it comes to doors, they generally fall into 2 categories. They are either controlled by a signal level or by signal pulses. When they are controlled by a signal level, you will usually find them controlled with a lever. One state represents the lever turned on, and the other state the lever turned off. In this case, on is closed, off is open. If they are pulse controlled, they switch between states for each pulse. So common are buttons, in the Java edition also node blocks, but you can also find occasionally target blocks being hit with projectiles to open the door from afar. Now, some pulse control doors only work properly if the incoming pulse has a certain duration. Here, as an example, I have my 2x2 aquarium door, which only works properly with a wooden button and will not work properly with a stone button. The reason is because it does certain things on the rising edge of the pulse and different things on the falling edge of the pulse. And if those two are too close together, it will get confused, or in this case, if I'm using a stone button, it will leave behind some of the fishes. Other doors will leave behind pistons instead, and that is then the point where you need to rebuild the door. So be aware of that issue. Now, some doors like this here have a minimum pulse length, others have a maximum pulse length, or need the pulse to be within or outside of a certain range of time. What is the case can be tricky to figure out if you don't know redstone circuitry in general and don't analyze the redstone circuit in this specific case. But there are a couple clues you can work with. For one, if someone using a wooden button instead of a stone button and it's not due to its decorative value, that is usually a good hint that you will need a longer pulse. Otherwise, as I said, it can be a bit tricky, but as a general rule of thumb, if you see in the original design a stone button, make sure the incoming pulse is 1 second long. If you see someone using a wooden button, make sure it's 1.5 seconds long. I will show you how to do that in just a few moments. And now it's time to talk about connecting multiple inputs to a single door. So if you have a button controlled door and you want to control it with multiple buttons, that is pretty simple. All you need to do is run all of the buttons into the same wire, which is effectively an OR gate, and you're golden. If you want to do the same with a lever controlled door and levers, you will need to use an XOR gate or an XNOR gate instead. The idea is pretty simple. The output toggles its state anytime I flick any of those levers here, and it doesn't matter which state they are currently in or the order I do this, it will always toggle the output. If I want to turn a lever effectively into a button, I'm going to need an edge detector, or in other words, an observer. So you can see every time I flick the lever, I get a short pulse out of that. If your door requires a certain pulse length to work properly, you're going to need to add a pulse length extender after the fact. So here I have 2 examples. This one here has an extension up to 10 redstone ticks. So this will produce a 1 second pulse, which is the equivalent of a stone button. And at the back here I have 15 ticks or 1.5 seconds, which is the equivalent of a wooden button. You can see I give it a pulse, 1 second here, 1.5 seconds there. They work exactly the same. This one here is a bit differently arranged, so it's only 1 block wide, but a bit higher. And then finally, if we want to turn a button into a lever, we need to use a so-called T-FlipFlop, which means every time it gets a pulse, it toggles its output state. And in this case, I'm using a copper bulb with a comparator. Now, let's get quickly back to our XOR gate from before. Because if you look closely here, you can see this is effectively a combination of first this, and then finally this. First, I'm turning the levers into buttons. Then they are all effectively connected here in the middle at the back, which is the OR gate. And then finally I'm turning the pulse back into a level signal with a T-FlipFlop. There are other ways to do this, but this here is very versatile because you can also run pulses from buttons into this. And every time you press the button, the output here will toggle. Or you can also add more observers. This, by the way, is also how I did the controls for this door here. So let me quickly get down here. And on this side, we have the repeater, which runs into this wire, gets transferred into a pulse. And then down here, we have the T-FlipFlop. On the other side, we have also some wire, which connects all of the inputs for pulses and are also running into the T-FlipFlop, which then controls the actual door. And now it's time to talk about spam proofing, so making sure even if someone spams your buttons or levers, the doors won't break. Now the first thing to know here is that you should do the spam proofing always after you've done the conversions and connections of your various inputs as shown in the previous part, and not before. Not only is it cheaper, but it also guarantees that it will work, which is not guaranteed if you try to spam proof each individual input. Now, in the following, I'll start with spam proofing levers or level controlled doors, and then later on buttons or pulse controlled doors. Now, first, when working with level signals, there are two potential issues. First, the signal may turn off too fast, so we have a short pulse, something like this here. So the door starts to open, and then in the middle starts to close again and leaves behind some pistons. Or the signal turns off too fast. Turns on too fast, so you have a too short pause. Now, if you just want to make sure the pulse remains on long enough, you can use a pulse extender. This means that even a short pulse will remain a longer pulse on the outside. Here I'm going with a simple comparator-based one, but you can also use others. So, if you have the reverse problem, so you want to avoid short pauses, you can first invert the signal, then again a pulse extender, and then revert the signal again. That means that even if you give it a very short pause, it will translate into a long pause. There's one problem if you try to do both, because those two counteract each other a bit. So let's say I give it just a short pulse on the inside, and you can see, besides of quite a bit of delay, the pulse is more or less unchanged when it goes through the system, because those two here, as I said, counteract them, because extending the pause means shortening the pulse again. So how can you get around this issue? Well, you can use a slightly different approach. When you run a repeater that is powered into the side of another repeater, it locks that repeater. So even if it would get power from behind, it will not react to that. Only once it's unlocked, it will start to react again. Similarly for depowering. To make use of that, you can use a self-locking repeater like this here. So this observer here is looking at the output of the repeater and running into a pulse extender. Here again, I'm going with a simple comparator-based one, but you can use also different ones. The extended pulse is also put into the locking repeater. And that means if I send in a signal, it will get detected, create a pulse at the back here, and for, in this case, around about 3 seconds, lock this repeater. Similarly on the off signal. Now, if I were to give it a short pulse, it will lock before the pulse has gone through the repeater completely. For 3 seconds, the repeater remains locked, so I have a 3-second pulse. And then I have also a guaranteed 3-second pause. And any changes I make before here are completely ignored in the intermediate time, which is very important for spam proofing a lever. There are a few limitations to this circuit. For one, the delay here in this chain from the observer through the system here to this repeater must be at most 4 redstone ticks. If it's 5 like here and I send through a short pulse, you can see the short pulse ended before the repeater was locked. So this needs to be fast. This is also the reason this here won't work in Bedrock, because of the idiosyncrasies of Redstone in Bedrock. So this is unfortunately a Java only build. If you want to fiddle around a bit, here are a few simple modifications. This way you can halve the delay to around about 1.5 seconds. As you can see, we now have double the decay of the signal and it goes down much faster. You can also double to 6 seconds basically by adding 2 more comparators, but there's one more change we need to make because we have now this flickering here, since this here needs actually a 4-tick pulse to properly set. Now usually you would just increase the delay here, but as I said, you need this to be as fast as reasonable. So instead you're going to have to add another repeater here, block there, then 2 wire there. And that way you now have a 6-second pulse followed by a 6-second pause. Yeah, that is basically how you can get this delay here modified very, very easily. And with that, let's get to what I find the most elegant solution, because it's very easily to customize, and that is the Etho-Clock. Now the Etho-Clock is a hopper-based clock that when I unlock it, you will see how it works. So I have 2 hoppers here facing each other, and they have a certain amount of items in there, and they are basically moved from one hopper into the other. Then the system flips and the direction reverses. The number of items in here determines how long each of those half cycles is. So 0.4 seconds for each item. With 5 full stacks, you are at about 21 minutes for each half cycle, which is a lot of delay you can work with. And simply by powering one of the pistons here, you can force the clock to wait at the end of one of the half cycles. And the moment I unlock the piston here, you can see it will switch over into the next half cycle and will continue from there on. And I can make use of that by adding a simple control circuit at the top here. So I'm powering one side and then through an inverter the other. And that means depending on what the input power is, I'm either ending at the end of one half cycle or the other. And by taking out a signal from the redstone block here on the side, I can turn this into a spam-proofed lever. Because the system down here will only change its state if all of the items have moved from one side to the other. And by adding more items, I can make sure the pulses and the pauses are longer. So you can see I give it a short pulse and I get out a longer pulse followed by a certain amount of time for the pause. And similarly, I can make sure the pauses also remain a certain amount of time. So very simple to build, and this works in Bedrock and Java. And now it's time to talk about spam-proofing buttons or pulse-controlled doors. When it comes to doors, there are 3 major problems. The first is inconsistent pulse length. So this is not really an issue if you just have one button, but let's say you have 2 buttons and they are activated by different players, so you get inconsistent pulse length, or for some reason there is even a repeater in the mix and you get pulses that are really short. So how can you get around that issue? First of all, we need our input. So now, to get a consistent pulse length, all you need to do is add a monostable circuit. So what we have here is a piston which will push the observer to over here, and that will provide us with a 1-tick pulse for every pulse we input into the system. If you need a longer pulse than that, just add a pulse extender as shown before, and you will have that too. The next problem are if the pulses come too fast, so if the pauses are too short. So if you mash the button, you only have about 1 second between the pulses, and that may be too fast. So what can you do? Well, just add a pulse extender. Again, I'm going with a simple comparator-based one. You power that, and you can see if I mash the button, nothing happens. I need to wait for this system here to relax before I can send through the next proper signal. But that is also a bit of an issue, because now we can actually spam lock the system. If we just keep spamming, this here will never be able to relax, and we never be able to actually do anything on the outside. So how can you solve this issue? Well, just add a piston. And that way, we can disconnect the input from the circuit, and we can keep spamming, and it simply ignores the spamming until it's ready to go again. If it's set up properly, you can even just add a lever here, and what you have effectively is a clock that produces pulses every couple moments. But that's just on a little side note there. Here at the back, I have essentially the same circuit, but without pistons, so silent. Instead of the piston here, I'm using a comparator in subtract mode. Again, I'm sending the signal back into this, and as long as the pulse at the back here is running, I won't be able to actually get anything through the comparator here since it's completely locked. And at the back here, I have a monostable circuit using some redstone logic, but nothing overly complicated. And now it's time for one of my absolute favorite circuits, which is this spam-proof T-FlipFlop here, which you will find in 90% of my bigger doors in some shape or form, potentially slightly differently arranged. Now, the way this works is we have an Etho-Clock at the bottom, and overlapping at the pistons and the block in between, we have a T-FlipFlop on top. The idea is the T-FlipFlop will only be able to change its state when it gets triggered, when at the same time the Etho-Clock at the bottom has finished its half cycle. As a quick reminder, the half cycle duration is the number of items that are moved in between the two hoppers times 0.4 seconds. So with 5 full stacks you would have 21 minutes. So what this means is, and down here we have the output, if I were to just start mashing the button here, it would ignore them until the clock here has run through one half cycle, and then it would only react to the next pulse. That is the general idea behind this circuit here. Now, in case you're wondering why I am inverting the input signal here, let me quickly show you this in action. So this is a falling edge triggered T-FlipFlop. So if you look at this here, you will notice it will only switch state once the button depresses. This means you need to wait for 1 second for a stone button or 1.5 seconds for a wooden button for this to react. If I were to invert the input signal, I just need to wait for the 0.1 second of delay for the torch, which makes this much faster. And it doesn't really add much complexity to the overall design. Now, this unfortunately only really works for Java, since it requires quasi connectivity. But with just some minute modifications, you have a universal design that works in Java, but also in Bedrock. For this to work, all you need to do is extend this 9 at the top here, move the torches to the side, and then, since pistons in Bedrock are just so slow, I needed to add one more repeater tick of delay on the side there. The rest of the circuitry is basically unchanged. It also works in Java, but as I said, this is mostly meant for Bedrock, since in Java I would prefer this one here since it's more compact and cheaper. Now, if you were to take one of those two designs and just cut off the second half of the control circuitry, you would end up with something like this here. And this here behaves slightly different now, because we are not locking one of the pistons. Once unlocked, the Etho-Clock will run through a full half cycle and then also the next half cycle and only stop then. That means you can use the circuit to automatically close the door after a short amount of time. So you press the button, and just look at this output here for now. You press the button, door opens, remains open, and then it closes again, and you need to wait a bit until you can open it again. That is basically how you can use this essentially spam-proof monostable circuit, or pulse extender you could argue. Another option to use this is to use it as, again, a spam-proofed monostable circuit. And if you look at the circuit here, you will notice that while this here is cycling through, it will power this wire here, and this wire here is only unpowered when this thing here is waiting. You can see it gets powered. Then we have one half cycle, and then at the end of the second half cycle, this here only unpowers. So you can use this to run into a monostable circuit like this one here to get the pulse, and then you have full control over the duration of the pause between further pulses. And now finally we have a couple variations of the spin-proof T-FlipFlop. This one here is a bit wider by moving the hoppers to the side of the pistons, which also reduces the height, and this in fact is a bit easier to squeeze into most corners in my bigger doors, so you will find this configuration the most often. Also it can be a bit cheaper since you can replace the redstone block here with a full block and then with some torches below, since now we have that space there left. The functionality itself remains completely unchanged. And this here is also a variation on that, which is only 4 blocks deep, but 4 or 5 blocks long, depending on how you look at it. I had to use this once since I didn't have a space that allowed for 6 long contraptions. The main reason for that is you have the hoppers in the middle and then the comparators going outwards, which requires at least 6 in total in length. Here, instead, I have them hidden on the side of the hoppers, and then I'm moving the signal along the edges. But the basic idea is the same. We have the hopper, Etho-Clock, and then we have the T-FlipFlop. And that brings us to the end of this episode. I hope you enjoyed it and will find the information contained in here useful in the future. I also wish you a nice day, and well, see you.